Okay, ladies and gentlemen, for this final session, may I introduce the speakers? And the first speaker is David Crowley, who's head of the School of Visual Culture at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, where he's been for 2 years, but some in the audience at least will probably associate him more with the Royal College of Art in London, where he was professor in the School of Humanities and led the critical writing in art and design programme there. David has a long-standing interest in the design of Central and Eastern Europe, with a particular emphasis on Poland, which was the subject of his first book, National Style and Nation State, Design in Poland. But he's since published a series of books, mostly about Central and Eastern Europe of the communist period, particularly 3 collections looking mostly at the material culture, one called Socialism and Style, one called Socialist Spaces, and one, The Pleasures of Socialism, which he edited with Susan Reed. David's also been a very prolific curator, and again, for many people in the audience, you will know that David was the curator with Jane Pavitt of Cold War Modern, the major exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. But more recently, he's been interested in the relationship between art, design and music, and of his recent exhibitions, Sounding the Body Electric, Experimental Art and Music in Eastern Europe, was held at the Museum Stucki in Łódź in 2012, and he's done other exhibitions, notably Notes from the Underground, Alternative Art and Music in Eastern Europe, which carries on this interest, first mounted in Łódź in the autumn of 2016, but it's recently been restaged in Berlin earlier this year. Well, today, David is developing some of these interests when he talks about Poland under Pilsudski. Please welcome David Crowley.
Paul gives excellent introductions, doesn't he? It's very kind of you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, to have this opportunity to speak, and to go back really for me to something that relates to research I was doing a long time ago, but has somehow been bubbling in the back of my mind. I've long been interested in this small architectural structure, which is appended to the side of the main entrance at Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. And it's always struck me as being slightly out of place or maybe slightly out of time. And its author, Adolf Szyszko-Bohusz, is a strangely Zelig-like character whose career spans, or at the same time often, combines a kind of arts and crafts sets of enthusiasms, before the First World War anyway, but in the 20s is working as an international style modernist. His credentials seem to be boosted by editing a magazine called Architect here, which has Malevich on the cover, but also at the same time is designing buildings like these, which seem to have a kind of relationship perhaps to Soviet socialist realism, something I want to try and work out. This might be partly to do with his intellectual formation. He trained in St. Petersburg under Leonti Benoit, the neoclassical architect. But I think more significantly, his intellectual training occurred within what we might call something like the School of National Romanticism in partitioned Poland, in Poland under foreign rule. And as I'm sure you know, in the late 19th century, the arts in Polish society were conscripted into the task of expressing, or even perhaps generating, what the Poles like to call Polskość, Polishness. This was an explicit rejection of the conditions under which the Poles lived as subjects of 3 separate empires, of Germany, of Austria-Hungary, and of Russia. So in this setting, architecture was very firmly connected. Architecture revival was connected to national revival. And before 1918, there are various claims which are made for different styles, as we thought about earlier today, different claims on a kind of authentically Polish style of architecture. So there were advocates of a Renaissance revival. There were champions of a certain kind of Gothic, a transvestibular Gothic, as it's known in Polish, a Gothic found along the route of the Vistula River. And then some of you will know very well, I'm sure, the Zakopane style, a kind of vernacular architectural and design style associated with the Highlander people living in the Tatra Mountains. All of these different styles were claimed as transmitters of some kind of authentic Polishness. All of them claimed some degree of distinction, that they could somehow speak for the nation. And of course, revivalism, it seems to me, paradigmatically needs some kind of sense of loss or threat. And in the Polish case, this was usually framed politically, that the German Kulturkampf or Russian Pan-Slavism was a kind of threat to the distinct nature of Polish culture. And just to take this a little further, let me give one example, one where artistic and architectural revival are connected to this project of national, or in this case, I think, social revival. In Krakow in 1912, the local Arts and Crafts Association, they organized an exhibition which they called Architectural Interiors in a Garden Setting in a park, the Jordan Park. We're going to go back there at the end of this talk in Krakow. And this was intended to be a kind of living demonstration of Garden City thinking. It included a number of model homes. So the middle-class family home was in the style of a dwór, which is a manor house, a traditional architectural form which was associated with the szlachta, with the nobility in Poland, the gentry class, the class that had claimed to be the nation for so long. But there was also a double house, or a house for two working families. Szyszko Bohusz, my Zelig character, he contributed a craftsman's house, this double height brick and timber structure, which included the workshop as well as the living accommodation for the family. So in many ways, this has a lot of aesthetic novelty, and we can think about the Vienna workshops and so on at the same time. So it has a claim on novelty, but it's really very strongly underscored by a kind of nostalgic attitude that I think very strongly affected, and I must say still today in Polish culture, continues to affect Polish cultural life. Romantic poets in the 19th century had been drawn to what they had seen as the kind of intimate world, the intimate world of the Sarmatian manor house of the 17th century. And late 19th century desire almost seems to want to bring this back, to somehow conjure it back into life. Svetlana Boym, in her brilliant book, The Future of Nostalgia, talks about a phantasmal logic. And we have an example here of a kind of phantasmal logic, because this exhibition didn't really mark any kind of return, evidently it didn't, to any historical truth. It's a kind of creative act which generates a past which never was. That's its phantasmal logic. And of course it generates a past in order to imagine a future. So one might see the 1912 exhibition and its principal architect, Tchaikovsky, as offering a kind of blueprint for a Poland restored. And in fact, Tchaikovsky was very explicit about this. He envisaged a sort of future Poland which would return to the map, and it would look like this. Poland with thousands of new enterprises, carpentry workshops, rugs and tapestry factories, weavers' shops and dye houses. Poland with smoking kilns, metalwork and glasswork. Poland of sculptors in wood and strong. Sorry, I made a note here, and a mistake here. Glove and purse makers, bookbinders, graphic artists, embroiderers and toy makers. So it's a completely sort of Mauritian view of a kind of arts and crafts world, I think infected with a kind of socialist politics, but ultimately a very conservative one that I think wants to somehow organize the world, as we've seen in those three house types, in neat social classes, where the aristocrats and the peasants can all live in some kind of harmonic community. Clearly a historical fiction. Ultimately, Tchaikovsky's view of this harmonic land of aristocrats and peasants didn't prevail in Poland after 1918, despite the fact that Tchaikovsky actually became a very vocal public figure. He became the director of the Warsaw Academy of Fine Art in 1923. And in fact, he had oversight. He designed the Polish Pavilion in Paris in 1925. And this, I think, in a way, this commission was a kind of a repayment of a debt, that he'd been this vocal nationalist. And here was his opportunity in the New Poland to speak. And he organized under this sort of very dramatic structure, under this kind of this sort of crystal-like lantern, a whole series of neo-vernacular interiors. But I think in a way, after Paris, after 25, the vernacular revival really comes to operate in quite a kind of narrow, marginal position within independent Poland. But that didn't mean that Romantic nationalism had finished. It didn't end in 1918, but it was changed. It was changed by the conditions of independence, and it was supplemented by a whole new set of myths, which is what I'm going to talk about now. These are very masculine myths around heroism. So if we think about the insurrectionary tradition, the tradition of violence, the revolutionary tradition of uprising against foreign rule, which had occurred in Poland in 1830, 1846, 1863, 1905, this had been a kind of catalogue of failure, and it had produced generations of martyrs, of exiles, and so on. Yet in the Romantic imagination, these disasters were taken as somehow evidence of the virtue of the national cause, and that the cult of the nation had been measured or somehow expressed through corpses. But in 1918, something happened that broke that pattern. 1918 threw up a victor, somebody who didn't die yet, Józef Pilsudski. And as the head of a state of a reborn country, he was the subject of a kind of living cult. His actions as an underground activist, a prisoner in Siberia, a prisoner in the Warsaw Citadel, his paramilitary activities where he robbed mail trains and so on, these were highly mythologized. These were mythologized partly by the soldiers who chose to heed his call in 1914 and form the Polish legions, form the Polish forces that were to fight through the course of the First World War. After 1918, and particularly after 1926, when Pilsudski had kind of led a sort of coup d'etat, he became the subject of really an official cult. His portrait was to be seen in every state office. His face was on Polish coins, streets, institutions, liners, aeroplanes. They were named after him. Keen young people could sign up and join the Legion of Youth, so like a kind of youth wing of that army organization, which promoted selfless duty and a kind of personal asceticism. These were virtues that were very closely associated with the Marshal himself, so you would live like Pilsudski. And over time, through the course of the 20s, the fact that Pilsudski had been a socialist, that he'd been very active in Polish socialist circles, these were slowly forgotten. The legions themselves became the subject of their own kind of minor cult. They were invariably in the 20s represented as a band of brothers who'd acted bravely and selflessly. They were very small in number, but that didn't really matter because in some sense the force of the legions was as much to do with their mythical status, their sort of cult-like status. And on my side here, Szyszko Bohusz, this architect who interests me, he was implicated as a former legionnaire. He was implicated in that cult. He was part of the people who constructed it, but he also benefited from it. He was given political office. He was given opportunities to practice as an architect, precisely because of his strong connections to the legions. And the legions were kind of interesting. They do self-mythologize still today, but in the legions, class seems to have counted for relatively little. The claim was that somehow by joining the legion, you had ennobled yourself, and that even somehow ethnic division counted for little. It's not really true, but it's part of the kind of myths of the legions. So Szyszko Bohusz gets benefits from his wartime CV. He becomes the other rector of the applied art of the museum, the Academy of Fine Art, this time in Krakow. He's also given major public commissions. He sits on committees. We're going to go to this place a couple of times. He's involved in conceiving and then shaping the tomb to the unknown soldier, which is constructed in 25 in the Saxon Palace in Warsaw and then opened with great pomp and circumstance in 26. He also produces a considerable body of work as an architect, which have these very close state connections. He designs the president's summer residence, which is known as Zamek, as the castle, in Wisła, which is in the Beskidi Mountains. He refused to be paid for this because he saw it as a kind of testimony to the president, who was a guy called Mościcki, who was a personal friend. And he designs this really, I think, amazing building in many ways. It's a series of these flat roofs. The pitched roof is added much later. A series of flat roofed geometric volumes, these masses. The interior is quite a kind of open plan of flowing spaces. It's furnished with tubular steel furniture, designed and made in Poland. It's decorated with this very, very vivid colour scheme. And I think really by the standards of the day, it's quite hard to find many official residences of this type that somehow might be framed within the broad picture of international style modern movement architecture. But you can make a claim for this building on those grounds, I think. Maybe Ataturk's Floria residence is a comparison one could make. We might put some limits on this comparison in that the castle has a lot of these kind of picturesque elements, but a historian called Ewa Chojecka has a very neat description of this place. She says that this new manor house in the mountains testified to a republican intelligentsia model of modern representation, deprived of any dynastic or ancestral prestige. So in a way, she's saying this is not a revival building. Now, I think what's striking for me is that Szyszko Bohusz's contributions to that big cult that attached to Pilsudski often take on a rather austere tone. They're rather unlike what I see as the very kind of kitsch and popular outpourings of enthusiasm for Marshal Pilsudski. So in the end of the 1920s, he's involved in designing a number of sarcophagi and crypts as part of large, grand public funerals which had been organized by the regime. And his job usually seems to be to somehow produce a rather kind of austere ending to what is often a rather kind of spectacular and very sentimental display of national unity. So this is the sarcophagus that he designed for this figure, Józef Bem. Bem was a 19th century figure who was a renowned soldier who'd fought really for Polish independence in the uprising in 1830. He'd been a participant in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. He'd only escaped death at the Battle of Sigiswar in 1848 by feigning his own death, where he fled to the Ottoman Empire and then converted to Islam and served as the governor of Aleppo, dying in 1850. And he was buried in a Muslim cemetery. Amazing life. In 1929, a committee was formed to bring his remains back to Poland. He was to be transported from Aleppo to the place of his birth in Tarnów. And this process occurred. The route that was taken was highly symbolic. It involved pausing en route at the National Museum in Budapest. The coffin also paused at Wawel, Wawel being a highly symbolic location in terms of Polish history. It's the burial place of Polish kings. And then commissioned by the mayor of Tarnów, Szyszko Bohusz designs the sort of final resting place for Bem, which is this box that sits on these tall Corinthian columns on a platform in the middle of a small lake in a city park. And the stone sarcophagus contained the general's coffin, but also urns filled with soil from all of the battlefields where he'd fought. Now, of course, the precedents for this we can probably find in Greek and Roman necropolies. Szyszko Bohusz's design, I think in many ways speaks to this, but it also clearly speaks to a kind of a rather poetic imagination as well. It's not really archaeological. These ideas of elevation and so on speak to something else. Now, the most important event in the Pilsudski cult was, of course, the funeral of Pilsudski himself. And this was a highly controversial affair. It actually drew the regime, the state, and the cardinal at Wawel into sharp disagreement, because the proposal was to put this former socialist, Pilsudski, this former soldier, in the resting place of Polish kings. And in the end, the church accepted this after considerable disputation. The body was embalmed, and he was displayed with his saber and his maciejówka, his cap, other symbols of ceremonial rank. He was displayed in this glass coffin, which is kind of extraordinary, and is clearly making some kind of statement about his everlasting effects. Initially, his body was placed in the crypt at Wawel, the St. Leonard's crypt, and his heart was transported to his mother's grave in Vilnius. But unfortunately, en route, the coffin had somehow let in air. It had been bumped over the cobblestones of this historic city in Krakow, and the coffin effectively had lost its airtight seals, and his body evidently began to deteriorate. So within months it was replaced by another coffin. Somehow NASA was... No, I'll take that. So tempting. It was designed by another figure who had the same kind of credentials, a sculptor called Szczepkowski, but the body continued to decay. And in fact, the crypt where it was initially placed was also inadequate. It was damp. But the most interesting thing to me was that the church was extremely unhappy, because all sorts of secular visitors who were attracted by the cult went there in a kind of festive mood to celebrate Pilsudski's life. And this was somehow seen to be inappropriate. So a solution was proposed, which was to produce another entrance to the crypt under Wawel, which would be a way in which those secular pilgrims could enter and pay homage to the Marshal. So Szyszko Bohusz is commissioned to do this, and his first schemes are rather kind of grand. Here we see this sort of Gothic temple capped with a figure of a hussar on horseback. But actually the final resulting crypt entrance was far less theatrical, far less spectacular. And I'm very interested in this and what it might be setting out to remember, how it functions. It features elements that clearly belong to a vocabulary of classical architecture, Corinthian columns, balustrades, a Latin inscription. But I think that Szyszko Bohusz, he composes these elements in a rather idiosyncratic fashion. The columns, when you look carefully, don't seem to perform their load-bearing function. The massive slab, which is fashioned from copper and bronze overhead, sits on kind of hidden posts, which create a gap between the top of the columns and that slab. It seems to float above those descending stairs. So as you go down, this thing seems to be floating above you. It seems to deny gravity. The vertical lines of the columns do continue through the slab into 6 little finials in the form of military crosses. The crypt itself was often described as a baldaquin, a reference to the cloth of state, which covered royal thrones and the beds of kings in the European tradition. And this, of course, is a way of marking Pilsudski's status. A little kind of footnote, we spend a bit of time looking, it's a nice shot, you get a sense of its slightly indirect positioning. We spent a little bit of time thinking about 1937, so I dropped these images in. This was the entrance to the Polish Pavilion in 1937 in Paris, which of course has a baldaquin. This cloth of state is hanging over the entrance, and you walk into a space which is a kind of rotunda, which has these figures of what would be translated as the honored. Various kings, national heroes, Kościuszko, Adam Mickiewicz, the poet, Chopin, and of course there's Pilsudski there. Interestingly, this Wawel crypt is also fashioned with particular materials. The stonework that we see for the crypt on the far side had been recycled from sections of a granite plinth which had supported a sculpture of Bismarck in Poznan until 1918. The octagonal bases and the Corinthian capitals of the columns had been recast from cannons, from the steel of cannons, which had been used to attack Krakow mid-century. And the nephrite columns of Krzyżoborzy's structure were salvaged from the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Saxon Square in Warsaw. The cathedral is particularly interesting. It was clearly a kind of demonstration of Russian power. It had been built in 1894, and that the Poles had decided, after a lot of discussion and quite a lot of protest, it's a very interesting history, to destroy that cathedral in 1924. So that Pilsudski's crypt entrance is fashioned from this salvaged material that had been taken very directly from the three empires which had partitioned Poland. So clearly the symbolism of this is very evident. I think the other thing about this is very interesting is that the demolition of the Russian cathedral had opened up a space, quite literally, for new urban forms in Warsaw. And so there was a sense of a kind of void at the center of the city, which was decided to become, was proposed as a new square. And of course, it was to be named Pilsudski Square. And there was a competition for this in 1935. And for modernist architects, so these are various architects associated with Siam, this square was an opportunity to do all sorts of urban renewal in the city, so that they proposed that they would build these, I can't see where my, oh, there it is. They would produce these large blocks in a kind of Siam manner alongside the river, that this was an opportunity to do slum clearance in the city. Krzyżoborzy's, of course, was also involved in this, and he too made his proposal, which was far more ceremonial, far more monumental. And I think here we go. It seems to carry all sorts of very strongly classical notes and accents. It was to kind of cut a symbolic access through the city, and that it would start at the top here. We see a view, very poor images, I'm afraid, but it would start at the grave of the unknown soldier in that Saxon palace. And then somebody on foot perhaps would walk through the center of the city, and they would pass through this this enormous rotunda structure, or this colonnade sitting in the center, or they might walk through this arch. And at this point in the city, Warsaw has this sharp escarpment here, and so these two structures would sit high on the city, and they would be super visible to anybody looking from the east. I think that really one could say that somehow this Warsaw scheme and the Krakow crypt are somehow conjoined, and I don't think just symbolically, just not simply because they carry the name of Pilsudski and so on, but also in some ways materially as well. And to make this connection, it's probably just useful to introduce the word spoiler here. In refashioning the crypt from the remains of Poland's enemies, Krzyżoborzy's was clearly making a direct reference to classical antiquity and to the idea of the trophy in ancient Greece or Rome, where the bloodied weapons of a defeated army would be stacked in victory to form some kind of monument. But what I think is really striking here is that whilst these recycled materials can be understood in those terms, they carry no signs or traces of their earlier lives. They don't even carry any signs or traces of the kind of the destruction which was necessitated for victory. And that's so striking that the post-war, post-Second World War, return of the grave of the unknown soldier after Warsaw had been so fundamentally destroyed puts so much energy on those marks of destruction. Here in the crypt, it's as if the spoiler is kind of sealed in some ways. So, in other words, the kind of emotional and the associative effects of spoliation are really heightened when we have the marks or the wounds of that dissection. But here, we don't seem to have them. And I think this is all about pointing to a certain kind of absence. It's a way of constructing a visible absence. It's really to be able to talk about the loss, in this case, the loss of the marshal. There's one other little kind of side note that I'd make before I give my sort of final set of examples. In the case of these columns, there's a sort of second symbolism, perhaps a rather more private symbolism at work. The cathedral in Warsaw, from which they came, had been designed by Krzysztof Bohusz's own teacher in St. Petersburg before the First World War, Benoist. So in a way, there's a kind of act of patriotism, but there's also something of patricide at work here as well. Now, reminiscences of this particular structure that people like to call a baldachin were also found unexpectedly in other buildings that Krzysztof Bohusz was designing in a far more self-consciously modernist idiom in the course of the 1930s. So we see this kind of double height entrance very typically in a lot of his buildings. And I just want to concentrate on this in my last example. This is the Józef Pilsudski House in Oleandry in Krakow. It was conceived during the time of the first meeting of the Polish legions in 1922, so a peacetime meeting of those former troops. And they formed an association and they were looking for a headquarters and they decided to build this building and to commission Krzysztof Bohusz. It was going to become a kind of museum, a museum to their own activities, and it would contain relics and documents testifying to the roles that had been played by Polish soldiers in the struggle for independence and so on. Its very location was highly symbolic. This had been the site where the first troops had kind of gathered and formed the nucleus of the Polish legions before engaging in battle with Russian forces in August 1914. I think it's purely coincidental, but oddly, as these relics also include the model for the exhibition of architectural interiors that was on precisely the same site in 1912. It's just a kind of odd coincidence. I'd love to elaborate some beautiful theory here, but I can't. Now, viewed today, this building, this Pilsudski House, looks perhaps rather more like the kind of abstract architectural compositions of the interwar avant-garde than either Krzysztof Bohusz or his partner, his co-designer, a guy called Strojek, than ever they intended. It's a central 5-story vertical block. It's connected to another 4-story block sitting stepped back behind it. It's got a kind of staggered footprint and a stepped profile that seems to point towards a kind of avant-garde sensibility. But it's also got this entrance, this sort of high canopy entrance, so this canopy sitting on columns that turns the corner of the building and somehow adds to its dynamic form. But the building itself is actually incomplete. It's only the southeastern corner of what was planned to be a much larger complex. And in the original design, 3 wings were to be arranged around a courtyard that would be connected with an elevated double-height arcade. So whilst the design was coded, I think, with a number of evident modernist elements, the strip windows, the flat roof, and so on, the scheme itself, in plan, was far more conventional. It was, I think, in many ways, highly retrospective. It seems to have the axial arrangements of classical Greek temples, like the Pergamon altar, which had been reopened to the public in 1930, it was very high in the public consciousness. Or it might speak to the gymnasium, the kind of training ground of kind of warrior poets, the training ground for competitors in Greek games and so on. There are other much closer to home precedents as well. It seems to me that actually it speaks very much to the setting of the tomb to the unknown soldier, the Saxon Palace, which had been remodeled in the 1840s in Warsaw under Russian rule. And I think these allusions to a kind of a classical past are all about consolidating this image of the brotherhood as a sort of, the legionnaires as a brotherhood of warrior poets. And of course, occupying the site of a mythical event, let's pass by that, where the call to arms in 1914 had been made, but dressed in the architectural language of the present of the 1930s. This was all about pressing the legion's claims to relevance, to their contemporaneity, their the need for them to exist. And of course, all of that was put under test in September 1939, just a few years later. So just to finish, really, just a word or two about how we might frame or think about this. And Trotsky is kind of interesting on this. He looked at what was happening in Poland, and he made direct connections between what he called Pilsudskiism and the Italian fascism that was being sort of marshaled around the central figure of Mussolini, but also the valorization of military valor, the sort of death cult, the idea of heroic death, the belief in the strong authority of the state. These two things would lend themselves to some kind of comparison, and hopefully we might have a chance to do that in discussion. And actually, Polish architectural writers were very keen to report Italian architecture. It's very well described and discussed in the architectural press in Poland. And they were keen to find parallels between Italy in the late 30s and Poland in the late 30s. And so, you know, the conventional way of talking about, say, Tyranny's work is to understand it as somehow an attempt to harmonize modernity with some kind of notion of tradition, some articulation of power. And we could do the same thing by thinking about Szyszko Bohus's work. But I don't really want to do that. I think there's some limits on that which we might talk about. So I'm just going to give one example, a slightly abstract example, but it comes from a really extraordinary essay written in the late 1930s by a guy called Jan Parandowski. And he called for a much more subtle understanding of Poland's relationship, not really to Italy particularly, but to the classical world. And he coins a word, or I suppose he adapts a word, which is łacińskość, which you might translate from Polish into English as Latinity. And he advances this in a really kind of odd essay, a really quite provocative essay. The essay is called Poland Lies on the Mediterranean Sea. It was written at the end of the 1930s. And he uses this article to attack the Romantic tradition, the tradition of the 19th century of that romantic nationalism. He said it was been too long. Romanticism lasted longer with us than anywhere else because it was more profound, more wide-ranging, and with loftier content. Poles flattering themselves. Our entire 19th century was in fact romantic. Pilsudski, a steel-willed man of action, was a romantic. The works of Słowacki, poet and writer, romantic leader, accompanied Pilsudski throughout his life. He quoted Słowacki's verses every day in his commands. But according to Parandowski, that romanticism of the 19th century had served its purpose, and it needed to be pruned or to be cut away from Polish culture, because what it did was obscure Polish connections, deeper connections to European culture. And that for Parandowski, this was found in something like the unconsciousness of language. In its grammar, in its orthography, Polish, he says, is a Latinate language. And that to recognize this would be able to really make true connections back to a much deeper historical tradition that Poland belongs to in the First Republic, which would be back to a kind of Renaissance humanism even. And I think in a way there's sort of echoes of this in Szyszko Bohus's work, in his case in his very strong interest in the classical. Not so much just in his quotation of classical forms, but in his kind of austerity. I think in a way his architecture can be understood not just as a contribution to the Pilsudski cult, but maybe also as an attempt to somehow discipline it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Actually, since we're just about on time, if there are any questions for David right now, we could ask them if there are any. You answered all the questions.
I say, I thought.
Yes.
I thought that one building had the look of the fabric of the period. And the building that was on the right side of the street, the
Modernist
Yes.
building.
With the awning,
no, the all the way the windows, the patterns, it was very patterned.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me reminded me a lot of the fabric of the period. And I just wondered if he looked at fabric designs, if he had any interest in any of that at the time?
Not that I'm aware of. It was interesting that Regal came up earlier today at the start, and it struck me that Semper would be, in many ways, the sort of overhanging figure in a lot of the discussions here, because the question of how does architectural form migrate and move, where does it come from, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, points back to his understanding of textiles. And in a way, this is a way that allows for a certain kind of revivalism to function, because it allows for the migration and movement of forms. And Semper would obviously work extremely well in thinking about Juliet's work as well there with ornament and so on. So I don't know about Žižka Bohuš's interest in textiles, but I think Central European architects read strongly.
Yeah, so it was a great presentation, and the thing about these like kind of quasi-Mannerist pieces of architecture is that they have this kind of like Janus-phase temporality to them. And for example, that particular object that you began your discussion with, it's like to me it was reminiscent of René Girardin's monument to Rousseau in Ermenonville. And Girardin is important because he was a protector of the deposed king of Poland, and it's this odd connection. But now looking forward, and I'm looking at, for example, the CM-esque plans for Pilsudski Square, and I'm reminded of the importance of the Liverpool School of Architecture as this conduit between like Polish modernism and, not CM style, but like the likes of Erich Mendelsohn and others in England during the Second World War. And the thing is, my recollection of the courses that were taught at the Liverpool School of Architecture by Brukolski, was one on the faculty who you have images by, was that it was not only modernist architecture that were being taught, but also vernacular styles with the idea of going back, rebuilding Poland in this kind of like hybrid style.
Yeah, there's a very strong discourse in the 1930s in Poland at the Liverpool School, which is where a lot of the young architects who'd escaped Poland in 1939 is where they ended up. Yeah. There was a very strong discourse about how to be modern, but also to somehow be modern within the means of the country. So you have these amazing drawings of sort of little modernist villas that are to be constructed from timber. And this isn't really about some kind of regionalism, it's really about a kind of utility and economy. I think the other thing as well that you pointed to, I think I'm sort of tempted to try and present a picture of Žižka Bohuš which is really coherent, because that's what we want to do when we have half an hour. Yeah. But I think he's not coherent at all as an architect. And one thing that I didn't talk about is his relationship to neoclassicism. It's really striking, because neoclassicism is the one architectural language which is not proposed before 1914 as a suitable language, precisely because it has all of those associations with, I think with Russia particularly. It had been but also maybe with the last king of Poland, Poniatowski, had been a great advocate for neoclassicism. So the past is really troublesome, and it has to be kind of managed. And in the end, I think what it points to is paradox rather than coherence.
Well, thank you, David. And we'll come back to some of these topics a little bit at the end.